My fiancé's phone lit up on the table. See you again tonight. It was saved under Plumber. We haven't had plumbing work in years. I was sitting at the kitchen table, half focused on the noise from the news playing in the background, when her phone lit up. The screen faced upward, and for a second, I almost ignored it. But the glow caught my eye, and there it was, 5 words that snapped me wide awake. It was saved under a name that didn't belong to any friend or family member. A tradesman's title. One we hadn't had reason to call in years. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't ask her about it when she walked back into the room. That's the kind of conversation where you only get one shot, and I didn't have enough in my hand to take it yet. Instead, I tucked the moment away in my mind like a razor blade in a sleeve. She sat down, took a sip of water, and slid the phone into her pocket without a glance. That night, lying next to her, I thought back over the past few months. Little shifts I'd dismissed at the time, her staying later at work, the new habit of taking calls in the other room, a sudden interest in dressing up for client meetings that never seemed to be in her calendar. I had chalked it up to stress or career ambitions. Now it all looked like pieces of a larger shape I hadn't seen before. The next morning, I started with the basics. I checked our joint email folder where utility bills and service confirmations were usually forwarded. The last plumbing work in our records was nearly 3 years ago, a broken faucet in the bathroom. No invoices, no messages, no nothing since then. I moved to our shared bank account, scrolling through transactions. I wasn't looking for direct payments. If she was careful, she wouldn't use a card for that. But there were cash withdrawals on a schedule. Small enough to blend in, large enough to raise suspicion when I saw the dates matched her late nights. I printed those statements and kept them folded in my desk drawer. Then I pulled out my laptop and began building a simple table. Dates, her stated reason for being out, where she said she was, and any bank or location data I could attach. At first, it felt like overkill. By the time I finished logging a month's worth, the pattern was glaring. She was always out on Tuesdays and Fridays, for roughly the same span of hours. I needed eyes on her movements, not just numbers. An AirTag was too risky. Some phones can detect unfamiliar ones nearby. So I ordered a hardwired GPS tracker designed for fleet cars. It arrived the following afternoon, disguised in plain packaging. That night, while she was in the shower, I slipped outside and secured it under the frame of her car. The first run of data came back the very next day. She left work at her usual time, but instead of heading home, she drove across town and parked at an unfamiliar apartment complex. She stayed there for 2 hours before heading to a coffee shop, then home. I didn't confront her. I wanted more. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern repeated with machine precision. Same location, same time frame. Each time, the tracker pinged the same coordinates. On the 3rd week, I decided to get a visual. I drove to the complex an hour after she'd left for networking drinks and parked a few spaces away from her car. The blinds on most of the units were closed, but I recognized her silhouette in one of the lit windows on the 2nd floor. She wasn't alone. A man's shape moved across the room, closer to her, and then both disappeared from sight. I waited in the car, timing her exit. When she finally came down, he was with her. He was taller than me, wearing a work jacket with no company logo, and had a way of walking that suggested familiarity with the space. They laughed at something between them before parting ways. I kept my headlights off and trailed him just far enough to see the building he entered 2 streets away. I noted the address and the make of his car. The license plate was easy to remember. I recited it to myself until I could write it down. Back home, I dug into public records. The plate came back to a man named Grant, living in the same neighborhood as that apartment complex. A deeper search revealed a conviction for fraud 5 years ago, with probation terms still active. That alone was a lead worth keeping in my back pocket. This was no random fling. She was spending time with someone who carried baggage that could blow up in her face, and, by association, mine. I didn't sleep much that night. My thoughts weren't just about betrayal. They were moving into strategy. I wanted proof that would stand up to more than a heated argument in a living room. I wanted evidence she couldn't spin. The following day, I called in sick and used the time to map out a new approach. First, I installed a discrete camera in our living room angled toward the front door. If she came home at odd hours, I'd have footage. Second, I set up a secondary email account for collecting any intel without risking our shared devices. Lastly, I reached out to a contact from a few years back, someone who had left law enforcement but still knew his way around private investigation work. By the time she came home that night, smiling and carrying takeout, I had everything in place. I played my part, eating dinner, asking about her day, and nodding at her half-hearted answers. When she went to bed, I stayed up under the guise of finishing work. Really, I was reviewing the GPS data and marking her next likely trip. If the pattern held, She'd be at that same apartment tomorrow evening. And that meant I'd be there too. Only this time, I wouldn't be sitting in a car. I was going inside. The plan for the following night began the moment she left for work. I knew she wouldn't be home until after the visit to that apartment, which gave me a wide enough window to move without risk. I kept my actions methodical. If I moved too fast or got sloppy, I'd tip my hand before I had what I needed. By the time she left her office building and the tracker pinged her heading toward the familiar address, I was already a few blocks away. I'd parked my car in a grocery store lot and approached the complex on foot, keeping to the sidewalk until I reached the rear entrance. The place was an older 3-story building with faded beige siding, the kind of structure where tenants rarely question new faces in the hallway. I waited until someone exited, catching the door before it latched. Inside, the smell of old carpet and stale air hung heavy. I didn't go straight to the unit. Instead, I located the mailboxes in the front lobby and scanned the names until I found his. The last name matched my earlier plate search. Above it, the number 2B was printed on a cheap adhesive label. A quick sweep of the hall confirmed the location. The lights inside 2B were on, though the curtains were drawn. I didn't need to knock or try anything reckless. I was here to observe. Across the hall was a vacant unit with a "For Rent" sign taped to the door. Its lockbox hung loosely from the knob. I pulled out my phone, pretending to take a call, while tilting the camera just enough to capture the frame of their door. 10 minutes later, it opened. She stepped out first, hair loose over her shoulders, wearing a different jacket than the one she'd left home in. He followed, carrying a folded paper bag and glancing both ways down the hall before locking up. They walked past me without recognition. I kept my face turned, pretending to scroll through messages. I gave them a 2-minute lead before leaving, following at a distance until they reached her car. They didn't part ways this time. He got into the passenger seat, and they drove off toward a side street. I returned to my own car and tailed them carefully, keeping far enough back to avoid being obvious. They stopped at a quiet restaurant on the edge of town. Not the kind of place for quick meals. This was a sit-down, candlelit atmosphere. They stayed for almost 2 hours. I stayed in the parking lot, catching photos each time they leaned closer across the table, her laughing at something he said. The final shot before they left was of him sliding his hand across the table to hers. When they parted outside, it wasn't with a handshake. It was the kind of goodbye that told me this wasn't a fling starting. It had been going on for some time. That night, I built a timeline with photos and GPS logs. I added the restaurant receipt to my file by checking their website for menu pricing and cross-referencing it with the exact timestamp from my images. The cash withdrawals matched their outings almost perfectly. The more I gathered, the more I realized this wasn't just about catching her. This was about understanding the full scope, because if she was willing to lie this easily, I had to assume the deception extended beyond her personal life. 2 days later, the GPS tracker showed something new. She skipped the apartment and went straight to his address instead. That was when I decided to dig deeper into him. I accessed county court records online, confirming the fraud conviction. The details showed he'd been caught in a staged home renovation scam, collecting deposits for work he never completed. His probation terms forbade certain types of employment and limited his travel, yet the GPS coordinates suggested he was already bending those rules. It was leverage, serious leverage. I took it a step further. I visited the apartment complex during the day under the pretense of looking for a place to rent. The property manager gave me a tour of a unit on the 3rd floor. While there, I asked a casual question about the neighborhood, steering the conversation toward safety and the kind of tenants in the building. She mentioned she'd had to issue a warning to someone in 2B for extra guests staying too often, hinting at noise complaints from neighbors. That told me their relationship wasn't invisible to the people who lived there. If I needed character witnesses later, I already had a lead. When Friday came around, I decided to risk closer surveillance. I positioned my car directly across from the entrance to 2B with a clear view through the narrow gap in the curtains. From there, I caught a blurred silhouette of her standing close to him in the kitchen, his hands on her waist. The photo wasn't perfect, but it was enough to confirm physical contact. Instead of confronting her when she returned home, I acted as though nothing was wrong. I asked about her team dinner, nodded at her vague answer, and watched her head straight for the shower. That was her routine, wash off any trace of wherever she'd been. The next day, I met with the private investigator I'd contacted earlier. I slid the printed timeline, photos, and GPS logs across the table. He examined them with a kind of professional detachment, noting how clean the evidence was but pointing out that hotel receipts or recorded conversations would make the case airtight. We agreed on terms. He'd follow her on her next few outings, keeping his distance but collecting what I couldn't without being noticed. The first report came back in less than a week. It included high-resolution images of her and him entering a hotel, checking in under an alias. The PI had also captured them at a bar later, her leaning in close while he whispered something that made her laugh. He recorded audio of her mentioning keeping this separate and not wanting to risk running into anyone from home. That was the point where suspicion turned into certainty. I wasn't piecing together fragments anymore. I had a complete picture of her double life. She was careful, yes, but not careful enough. And the man she'd chosen wasn't just a side distraction. He was a liability with a criminal history. I started to think less like a partner and more like someone setting up a case file. Each page, each screenshot, each timestamp added weight. If I pushed this in the right direction, I could dismantle her life without raising my voice once. But that kind of move required perfect timing. I wasn't going to blow this open in a private argument she could deny. I wanted the truth to come out in front of the people whose opinions she valued most, people she couldn't manipulate with half-truths. And by the end of that week, I had exactly the opportunity one needed to set the stage. By the time the private investigator's second report landed in my inbox, I knew the window for action was opening. This batch was heavier than the first. Video clips of her entering the same hotel with him twice in 1 week, receipts for dinners that would have cost a month's groceries, and a short audio clip where she talked about getting her situation sorted before the wedding. Those last words hit like a steel rod to the ribs. It meant she was still planning to go through with our engagement, still planning to look me in the eye at the altar and pretend everything was as it should be. I didn't want to just expose her. I wanted to do it in a way that she couldn't spin, couldn't paint herself as the victim, and couldn't recover from without leaving a permanent dent in her life. That meant her family had to see it, my family had to see it, and ideally, she'd be caught in a moment where she couldn't flee or destroy evidence. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Her parents had planned to come over for dinner the following weekend, something she had mentioned casually, probably thinking it was a nice, family bonding gesture before the wedding. I agreed instantly and even suggested we invite her younger brother too, knowing he was protective of her but also had little patience for dishonesty. If the truth broke in front of him, his opinion would carry weight with the rest of her family. From that moment, the dinner wasn't about food. It was about choreography. I mapped out the living room, making sure the TV could be seen clearly from the dining table. I tested my laptop's HDMI connection twice, loading up a folder I'd named Vacation Ideas, but filled with GPS screenshots, date-stamped photos, and a couple of the PI's videos. The folder was arranged so that the first few images looked like normal, harmless travel pictures, so when the shift came, it would hit harder. 2 days before the dinner, I called the private investigator one more time. I wanted a final sweep, anything fresh to add to the pile. He came through with a recording from just the night before. Her and the plumber leaving the apartment complex together, him carrying an overnight bag, her leaning into his shoulder in the parking lot. It was clear enough that no one could call it an innocent gesture. The day of the dinner, I went about things as normally as possible. I made sure she believed I was in full host mode, helping with table settings, running out to get her favorite wine, joking about how her father would inevitably complain about the traffic. Inside, I was running a mental checklist, evidence ready, cables in place, backup copies saved to a USB drive in my pocket, audio levels tested. They arrived at 7 sharp. Her father shook my hand, her mother gave me a polite hug, and her brother gave me that nod men give when they're trying to read if something's off. We sat down, and for the first half hour, it was small talk. Updates about work, a few stories from her parents' recent trip, and her laughing a little too loudly at things that weren't that funny. I caught her glancing at her phone more than once, but she didn't leave the table to check it. When the plates were cleared for dessert, I made my move. I excused myself, pretending I was going to grab something from the kitchen, but instead I dimmed the lights slightly and pulled up the Vacation Ideas folder on the TV screen. I started with a few genuine vacation photos from years ago. Us at the coast, a city skyline we'd visited. Everyone smiled politely. Then I clicked to the next image. It was a GPS map from my tracker, with her car's movements highlighted. Her mother tilted her head slightly. Her father's brow furrowed. Her brother leaned forward. The next image was a time-stamped photo of her car outside the apartment complex. Then came the photo of her with him in the parking lot, laughing, his hand on her back. I didn't speak. I let the sequence tell its own story. When the first hotel footage played, the air in the room changed. Her mother's hand went to her mouth. Her father sat back slowly, his face turning a deep, dangerous red. Her brother muttered something low under his breath, eyes locked on his sister. She didn't move at first, like she couldn't quite process what was happening. Then she pushed her chair back sharply, muttering that this was insane and out of context. I didn't respond. I just clicked to the audio clip where her voice clearly mentioned keeping her life separate and not risking running into anyone from home. Her father turned to her, not me. He asked her directly if it was true. She didn't answer, just grabbed her phone and bag and walked toward the front door. But I'd planned for that too. While she was scrambling for an exit, her brother stood and blocked the hallway. He didn't touch her, but his presence was enough to make her stop. That gave me the opening to speak, not to argue, but to explain exactly how I'd gathered every piece of evidence. I listed the cash withdrawals, the GPS logs, the photos, and the PI's role. I even mentioned the plumber's full name and criminal record. Her father's voice was low when he finally said she should sit back down. She didn't. She muttered something about me spying and manipulating her family, then brushed past her brother and slammed the door on the way out. The silence she left behind was thick. Her mother stared at her untouched dessert. Her father kept shaking his head slowly, and her brother looked like he was weighing whether to go after her or not. I broke the silence by telling them there was more they needed to know, that the man she was seeing wasn't just a side fling, but someone with a documented history of fraud, that if she stayed with him, she'd eventually be pulled into something much worse than infidelity. I slid printed copies of the public records across the table. Her father didn't say much after that, just gathered the papers and tucked them into his jacket pocket. Her brother left a few minutes later without dessert, muttering that he'd handle it. When they were gone, I locked the door, unplugged the laptop, and transferred every file to a secure drive. I knew she'd be back at some point, angry, defensive, maybe even desperate, but she'd be walking into a home where her credibility was already gone. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. It was short. "You've made a big mistake." No name, but the tone screamed of him. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded it to the PI, who added it to the file along with everything else. The following morning, I called the bank and had her removed from all joint accounts. I notified the landlord that she would be vacating within the month. I contacted our wedding vendors, canceling each booking in turn. Every deposit loss was a small price to pay for the control I was reclaiming. By the end of that week, word had spread. Her family wasn't defending her. My friends weren't asking, "Are you sure?" They'd seen enough to know. The trap had worked exactly as intended. No shouting, no physical confrontation, no room for her to twist the narrative. Just the cold weight of undeniable proof, dropped in front of the people she'd hoped would never find out. And as far as I was concerned, that was only the first phase of her collapse. After that dinner, the house felt like an emptied stage after the play ends, quiet, with the echo of words still hanging in the air. I knew she wouldn't come home that night. She had too much pride to face me immediately, especially with the evidence I had laid out in front of her parents. But I also knew avoidance wouldn't last forever. She'd come back, if only to salvage whatever she thought she could. I didn't wait for that moment to act. The next morning started with a call to our landlord. I told him we were separating, that she'd be vacating the property, and that I wanted all lease communications sent directly to me from that point forward. I also paid the next month's rent in full to keep control of the unit. Once the payment cleared, I had him add a note to her file. No access without my written consent. The bank was next. I moved every cent of my funds out of our joint accounts into a new one she had no knowledge of. I had the banker freeze the old accounts for security verification. She'd wake up to find her debit card declined and her credit card inactive. If she wanted money, she'd have to ask, and I had no intention of giving her any. By the afternoon, I'd made calls to each wedding vendor. The venue, the caterer, the florist, the photographer, all canceled. The deposits were gone, but that didn't matter. The point wasn't to save money. It was to make sure she couldn't try to pivot into damage control with a postponed ceremony. The wedding was dead, and I wanted that reality to hit her like a brick wall. Around 4 that afternoon, I got my first sign that the news was spreading. A friend texted me saying he'd seen her at a cafe downtown, crying to someone on the phone. He didn't hear much, but he caught her saying something about everything being taken from her. I went to bed early that night, knowing the storm would hit the following day. It started just after 8 in the morning, a loud, repeated knock at the door. I didn't rush to answer. When I finally opened it, she was standing there, hair disheveled, clothes wrinkled, with the kind of look people get when they've gone through a night without sleep. She didn't try to walk past me. She just stood there, phone in hand, and asked why her cards didn't work and why the landlord told her she was no longer authorized on the lease. I didn't engage with questions. Instead, I handed her a manila envelope. Inside was a copy of the evidence file, the lease update notice, and the banking paperwork. On top was a single-page letter stating that the engagement was terminated, all shared assets were under my control, and she was to remove her belongings within 48 hours. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just stared at me with a cold, sharp expression that told me she'd switched into survival mode. Without a word, she turned and left. But the next part of the fallout wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the man she'd risked everything for. That same week, I had the private investigator forward all relevant photos and location logs to the man's probation officer. It wasn't about the affair. It was about his repeated visits to hotels outside his allowed travel area, the fact that he was likely paying in cash without reporting income, and his association with someone who could be a financial resource for him, her. I didn't expect it to lead to immediate arrest, but it was a lever worth pulling. 2 days later, I got confirmation that it had worked. A neighbor texted me a photo of a police cruiser parked outside his building, with 2 officers escorting him to the car. The caption read, "Guess who's in trouble?" That same day, her mother called me, not to defend her daughter, but to tell me she'd moved back into her cousin's spare room. The cousin's place was 2 towns over, far enough to make any casual visit inconvenient. Her mother also admitted that they'd confronted her about the man's criminal record, and she'd tried to claim she didn't know. The problem was, I'd already given them the timeline showing she'd known him for months. The lie only made her look worse. Then came the job. One of the private investigator's side recommendations had been to look into her professional life. Sometimes affairs bleed into the workplace in ways people don't realize. I didn't even have to dig far. Using an anonymous email account, I sent her employer a tip linking her to someone under active probation for fraud, attaching a couple of photos of them together along with a note suggesting they look into recent expense reports. I didn't know if she'd been using company funds to bankroll her outings, but it was enough to raise suspicion. By the following Monday, she was out of that job. I didn't get the official reason, but the timing spoke for itself. The collapse wasn't just financial, it was social. Our mutual friends either sided with me outright or went silent toward her. She stopped posting on social media entirely, likely to avoid the barrage of questions and comments. Her world had shrunk to the size of her cousin's apartment. I didn't hear from her directly again until nearly a month later. It was a short email, not an apology but a warning. She wrote that I'd crossed the line by involving her family and that I'd regret making an enemy out of her. I read it twice, saved it to my records, and didn't reply. Empty threats from someone who had already lost her leverage meant nothing. The final piece of closure came from an unexpected place. A letter from the county probation office confirming that the man, Grant, had violated his terms and was serving a 6-month sentence. They thanked me for bringing certain activities to light. I couldn't help but think about the irony. She'd gambled our engagement, her job, and her standing with her family for a man who was now behind bars. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt my life quietly. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen much during the engagement. I took a short trip out of state, leaving my phone on silent for most of it. When I came back, the apartment felt lighter, every trace of her gone, the space entirely mine. I didn't block her family. If they wanted to reach out, I had no reason to cut them off. In fact, her brother sent me a message one evening, saying he respected the way I'd handled everything. He admitted he'd confronted her the night of the dinner after she left, and that she tried to twist the story into me being controlling. But when he'd asked her point blank if the man in the photos was her lover, she'd gone silent. That was all the confirmation he needed. Her mother sent a different kind of message weeks later, just a short note saying she hoped I was doing well and that she was sorry things had turned out the way they did. I appreciated it for what it was, not a plea for reconciliation, just an acknowledgement that they'd seen the truth for themselves. The engagement ring stayed in my desk drawer for a while. I considered selling it immediately but decided to wait until the sting had worn off. Eventually, I took it to a jeweler, got a fair price, and used the money toward a new car. A practical replacement for something that had become nothing more than a reminder. Looking back, the most important part wasn't catching her. It was making sure I controlled the timing, the setting, and the narrative. By turning it into a calculated exposure instead of a shouting match, I'd ensured she couldn't rewrite the ending. Everyone who mattered had seen the same unfiltered truth. And that was something she couldn't undo, no matter how many stories she tried to tell afterward. As for her, last I heard, she'd left her cousin's place and was living in a rented room near the edge of the city. No job in her old field, no steady income. And, if the rumor from a mutual acquaintance was true, no more contact with the man she'd thrown it all away for. That was the consequence she had earned, and the one I had patiently built, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for her to stand on. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.